Welcome to Echo 321, Study Session 12, Poverty and Inequality. Introduction. In this study session, we will explore the concept of poverty and inequality and their measurement. Specifically, we will examine if there is a relationship between poverty, inequality, and per capita income. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Define and use correctly the term poverty. 2. Discuss ways of measuring inequality. 3. Describe ways of measuring poverty. Concept of poverty. Until recently, poverty was defined exclusively as a shortfall in private consumption or income and viewed in absolute rather than relative terms. An alternative approach includes additional elements such as access to common property resources and state-provided commodities, and broadens the concept of poverty to include possession or lack of assets, dignity, autonomy, and time. Proponents of this approach argue that poverty should be viewed as a process rather than a state of being, and that those living in poverty should be seen as deploying whatever asset they possess in an effort to cope with poverty. Reconciling the concept of absolute and relative poverty is a capacities approach, which points out that relative deprivation in income and commodities can lead to absolute deprivation in minimum capacities. Thus, poverty in absolute terms is seen as related to relative deprivation and social inequality. This approach focuses not on income poverty, but on human poverty, defined as the denial of opportunities and choices to live a most basic or tolerable human life. The World Bank World Development Report has also revisited its concept of poverty to include both physical and social deprivation, including powerlessness. It is now more widely acknowledged that poverty, 1, is not just a shortfall in consumption of income, but is multidimensional, involving lack of power, assets, dignity, access to public resources, and time. It is a dynamic phenomenon that is socially reproduced over time and from one generation to the next. It is the consequence of intersecting structural inequalities across and within nations, such as those based on class, race, and gender. Those patterns of inequality are seen to be of crucial importance in understanding as well as reducing poverty. It is experienced differently by men and women. In addition, it recognizes that while growth is important for poverty reduction, countries cannot rely on high growth rate as the primary way to reduce poverty, and empowerment of poor people, particularly women, is critical to poverty reduction. Measuring inequality, size or personal distribution of income. Income distribution can be measured either by personal size distribution of income or the functional distributive factors, share distribution of income. The personal size distribution simply deals with individual persons or households and the total income they receive. It ignores the locational and occupational source of the income. A common method is to arrange all individuals by ascending personal income and then divide the total population into successive distinct groups or sizes like decile. You can then calculate the cuteness ratio, plot the Lorenz curve, and calculate the Gini coefficient. The cuteness rationale is a measure of income inequality that is calculated as the ratio of income received by the top 20 to income received by the bottom 40. That is, measure of inequality according to Kuznets ratio equals share of income received by the top 20 over share of income received by the bottom 20. Kuznets ratio is often used as a measure of the degree of inequality between high and low income groups as a country. The Lorenz curve. Another common way to analyze personal income statistics is to construct what is known as Lorenz curve. The Lorenz curve is a tool used to represent income distribution as proposed by Lorenz in 1906. It tells us which proportion of total income is in the hands of a given percentage of population. This method is conceptually very similar to the method by quartile. However, instead of ending up with income shares, the Lorenz curve relates the cumulative proportion of income to the cumulative proportion of individuals. Lorenz curve. Another common way to analyze personal income statistics is to construct what is known as Lorenz curve. The Lorenz curve is a tool used to represent income distribution as proposed by Lorenz in 1905. It tells us which proportion of total income is in the hands of a given percentage of population. To build a Lorenz curve, after sorting the income distribution by income level, you first need to calculate the proportion of income belonging to each individual and which proportion of total population that same individuals represent, and cumulate both proportions. Plot the two cumulative proportions and compare it with the benchmark for the Lorenz curve, the equidistributed income line. The equidistribution line is defined on the basis of the most equalitarian income distribution given population. In an ordinary income distribution, not all incomes are equal. That means that the Lorenz curve will always lie below the equidistribution line. The x-axis records the cumulative proportion of population ranked by income level. The y-axis records the cumulative proportion of income for a given proportion of population. That is, the income shared calculated by taking the cumulative income of a given share of the population divided by the total income y. The step-by-step procedure to build a Lorenz curve is summarized as follows. Step 1. If not already sorted, sort the income distribution by income level. 2. Define the proportion of income owned by each individual household and its proportion on total population. 3. Define the cumulative proportion of income and the cumulative proportion of population. 4. Define the line of equidistributed income. 5. Plot the cumulative proportion of income against the cumulative proportion of population. Gini coefficient. This is an aggregate measure of inequality that varies between 0 and 1. It is a quantitative measure of how far a society is from being perfectly equal. It is a very convenient shorthand summary measure of the relative degree of income inequality in a country. It can be obtained by calculating the ratio of the area between the diagonal and the Lorenz curve divided by the total area of the half square in which the curve lies. This ratio is known as the Gini concentration ratio of Gini coefficient. 4 possible Lorenz curves, such as might be found in international data, are drawn in figure 12.3 below. Whenever one Lorenz curve lies above another Lorenz curve, the economy corresponding to the upper Lorenz curve is more equal than that of the lower one. Whenever two Lorentz curves cross, such as B and C, we need additional information or assumptions before we can determine which of the underlying economy is more equal. We could use an aggregate measure such as the Gini coefficient to determine the matter. The Gini coefficient is interesting because it satisfies the following four desirable characteristics. 1. It is anonymous. It does not treat some people as better than others. It just reports their income. It does not depend on who has the higher income. 2. It is scale independent. It does not depend on the size of the economy or the way it is measured. 3. It is population independent, changing the amount of people but keeping the income distribution constant does not change it. 4. It follows the transfer principle, transferring income from a richer to a poorer person. Measuring inequality, functional distribution income. These attempt to explain the share of total national income that each of the factors of production, that is, land, labor, and capital, receives. According to the theory of functional income distribution, incomes are determined by the demand for the inputs and by its supply. For example, the supply and demand for labor are assumed to determine each market wage. When this is then multiplied by the total level of employment, we get a measure of total wage payment, also sometimes called total wage bill. Measuring absolute poverty. This may be measured by the number of head count, age of people whose income falls below the absolute poverty line, YP. The head count index, HN, divides this number by the population. The limitation of this measure is that it occurs the same width to those below the poverty line. For example, if the poverty line is set at $365 per person, it makes a big difference whether most of the absolutely poor earn $350 or $300 per year. Economists therefore calculate the total poverty gap that measures the total amount of income necessary to raise everyone who is below the poverty line to that line. Figure 12.5 illustrates how we would measure the total poverty gap as the shaded area between poverty line and the annual income profile of the population. Why is the income of person high? And on a per capita basis, the average poverty gap, APG, is calculated by dividing TPG by the total population. That is, APG equals TPG over N. Often, we're interested in the size of the poverty gap in relation to the poverty line, so that we would use the normalized poverty gap, which lies between 0 and 1. The MPG is useful when we want a unitless measure of the gap for either comparison. The formula for MPG is MPG equals APG over YP. Another important poverty gap measure is the average income shortfall, which is the real poverty gap divided by the head count of the poor. That is, AIS equals TPG over age. The AIS tells us the average amount by which income of a person falls before poverty line. This measure can also be divided by the poverty line to yield a fractional measure, the normalized income shortfall. That is, NIS equals AIS over YP. Foster-Gray-Tokbecki index. We are also often interested in the degree of income inequality among the poor, such as the Gini coefficient among the poor. GP, or the coefficient of variation of income among the poor. CVP, that is the Gini or CV among the poor, can be very important because the impact on poverty of economic shock can differ greatly depending on the level and distribution of resources among those who are poor. The Foskagre-Tokbeki Index, often called the PIST class of poverty, is a measure that satisfies the following desirable characteristics of poverty measure. 1. Anonymity. No person is worth more than another. 2. Population independence. A large population doesn't change it. 3. Monotonicity. Making a person richer won't decrease the index. 4. Distributional sensitivity. Taking income away from a poor person and makes the poverty index worsen. Depending on the value of alpha, the P-star index takes on different forms. If alpha equals 0, the numerator is equal to H, and we get the head count ratio, H over N. If alpha equals 0, we get the normalized poverty gap. It is clear that increases whenever H over N or NIS or CVP increases. It is increasingly used as a measure of transfer by the World Bank and most UN agencies. And this is used in most empirical work on poverty because of its sensitivity to the depth and severeness of poverty. Summary. In this study session, you have learned inequality, its measurement, either by size distribution or functional distribution of income. Size distribution examines how much income a particular household earns by sorting people according to income and putting them in major groups. The Cotness ration is a measure of income inequality that is calculated as a ratio of income received by the top 20 to income received by the bottom 40. Gini coefficient is a very convenient shorthand summary measured for the relative degree of income inequality in a country. Measure of poverty include total poverty gap, average poverty gap, normalized poverty gap, and average income shortfall and normalized income shortfalls. This is the end of study session 12. Thanks for listening.